French police have reportedly detained over 10,000 Yellow Vest protesters since the start of the anti-government movement in November of last year. French Daily Le Monde cited data from the country's Ministry of Justice as saying that around 3,000 protesters received guilty verdicts by the courts. Some 400 protesters were also handed down prison sentences with immediate incarceration. Now, many people were also sentenced to compulsory community service, while others convicted to suspended prison sentence. Originally sparked by rises in fuel taxes, the Yellow Vest protest quickly snowballed into a widespread revolt against President Emmanuel Macron's government and its economic policies. At least 10 people have died and thousands of others injured in the weekly protests so far. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. PressTV's very own Ramin Mazaheri out of Paris, and out of Ontario, Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst out of Ontario. Thank you both for being with us. Going to start it off with Ramin to fill us basically on what has taken place. Now, it's almost been a year that we have been talking about these protests, and some unbelievable statistics actually now just coming out.
Yeah, and I think we have to take these statistics with, something like 1 kilo of a grain of salt, because these are the official state stats, and they certainly seem very, very low in many ways. But even if we take them at their word, we're talking about, as you said, 10,000 people being arrested, several thousand being rushed through the system and already convicted. And then, you said that what they're saying is that the 400 or 500 people that have been given prison sentences, they are suspended sentences. That's not really the case. You have countless people who have gone who are in prison for 1 to 3 years. That's usually, what they're given. And these people, they have all been made an example of. But we have to remember how many people, have been hurt. We're talking about among the protesters officially, 3,000 or 4,000 people who have required, treatment, and then you have about 500 people who have been critically injured with things like head injuries. You have 25 people who have lost an eye. You have 5 people who have lost their hand, and then you mentioned that there are 11 deaths related to the Yellow Vest protests. Now, the last thing I'll say here is that just this week we had the first time of a cop who is going to have a trial for police brutality. So we've given you all of these, incredible numbers, and this week they have 2 cops who are going to trial. If French history is any indication, they're not going to be convicted, and if they are, the penalties are going to be very light. These 2 cops, despite all of the serious injuries, one was caught on video slapping them. And then one cop was caught on camera throwing rocks. So we see really, one way, 2 different measures here, if you're a cop and if you're a Yellow Vest. So certainly this is something that has been hanging over, every Saturday. Nobody really knows what's going to happen and if they're going to make it out alive. And I really can't, stress the, honesty of that statement. It's every Saturday. PressTV has been out there, Hispan TV, Iranian in Spanish, Iranian journalists in Farsi, and Russia Today. And we are the only people who have been covering this protest for months. So all the credit goes to the Yellow Vest. 52 weeks, who would have thought it? And it doesn't show any sign of stopping.
All right. Well, Jason, your take on all this. I mean, almost 1 year, the 1-year anniversary coming up. And of course, as Ramin, our correspondent on the ground there, has said, I mean, basically, nothing is really covered in the mainstream press or the domestic press in France. And yet we see it continues almost a year later, and we see how the French government has actually come down quite hard, even if these statistics are correct, which, as Ramin said, it's not likely. But even so, it's unbelievable how harsh they have been with the protesters. Your take on all of this?
Well, I think it's very symptomatic of who it is and whose interests are being defended in this case. I mean, personally, myself and other people as well did not think the protests would actually last this long. And I'm certain that Parliament in France didn't think that they would last this long either. But it seems that this issue of trying to avoid these kinds of neoliberal reforms are what the people of France are really out there every day, essentially risking their lives in order to try to avoid. I mean, the mainstream media is currently bombarding us with everything about China, trying to cover the Hong Kong protests, etc., while blatantly leaving the not just the French protests, but the protests in Chile and the Nakba Day right of return in Palestine as well. They're leaving these completely behind, and in many cases, not even acknowledging their existence. And I think that speaks volumes about where power lies in this situation. It doesn't want these things to be known about. It doesn't want these protests to be heard of because it doesn't suit their interests. I mean, these are people questioning power in many of these cases, but they're very happy to watch the Hong Kong protests go on and champion them uncritically, leave out very specific information, particularly with regards to a recent assassination attempt on a lawmaker inside of the country. So I think that the French people have displayed more determination in this situation than I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that they were going to. I didn't think that these protests would go on that long. But I think it definitely speaks to the spirit of this. I mean, this is something that has been boiling, particularly in France, for some time now. And I think that the fuel tax in this case was just the straw that broke the camel's back that really kicked all this up. It might have been the spark that ignited the prairie fire. And I think that if it's gone on this long and the protesters have been willing to suffer this much through blindings, beatings, severe injuries, even deaths, I think that they're probably going to be going along for much longer.
All right, and of course we're going to be keeping our eyes on that. Thank you both for being with us, Rami and Mazaheri. PressTV's correspondent on the ground there in Paris, and Jason Unruhe, political commentator out of Ontario. And thank you, viewers, for staying with us on another News Review.